On the night of Saturday, the 13th of November, 2004, in a tiny city called Craig, Alaska, all the people who were attending the Chamber of Commerce banquet suddenly stood up and broke into applause for 48-year-old Lauri Waterman. Lauri was sitting at a table in the back of the room. She was tall, with short brown hair, and her skin was very pale, but at this moment, her cheeks were flushed red with embarrassment. As she looked around at all the familiar faces smiling at her, Lauri knew almost all of the 1,300 residents in Craig, Alaska. From her many years as a community volunteer and special education teacher's aide, Lauri definitely knew everyone at this banquet because she had helped her friend organize it. From the podium, Lauri's friend told the room that she couldn't have put on this event without Lauri, and that Lauri was really the one person in Craig, Alaska, that people could always count on if they needed help with anything. Lauri stood up, smiled sheepishly, and waved at all the people in the room as they continued to cheer for her. Lauri wished her husband, Doc Waterman, had been there to see this, but unfortunately, he was hundreds of miles away in Juneau, Alaska, on a business trip for the weekend. Lauri's husband was a prominent real estate agent. Still, Lauri had the feeling that this was her lucky night. She had won the raffle for a fleece jacket earlier in the evening, and by the time the dinner wrapped up at about 10 p.m., so many people had thanked her personally for all her help through the years that she truly felt appreciated and celebrated. At the conclusion of the banquet, Lauri hugged her friend, who she had planned this banquet with, and then said she would see her again the next day after church. Both Lauri and her friend were on a committee that helped raise money for an international Catholic event for young people. The friends hugged one more time, said goodbye, and then Lauri turned around and headed for the parking lot. Lauri drove her purple minivan to a peach-colored house at 604 Ocean View Drive with its spectacular view of the bay. The 3-bedroom, 3-bath house was one of the nicest in town, but to Lauri, the house always felt a bit empty whenever Doc was away. Also, this night, Lauri and Doc's 16-year-old daughter, Michelle, was out of town at a volleyball tournament in Anchorage. So tonight Lauri was going to be all alone. As Lauri headed upstairs for the night, she walked past Michelle's bedroom and thought about the fight they had had right before Michelle left town with her volleyball team. Lauri had seen the all-black outfits that her daughter was packing for this trip and asked Michelle why she couldn't bring something a bit more cheery. Lauri was not a big fan of the goth stylings that Michelle had adopted over the last year, but Lauri's daughter just rolled her eyes at her mother as soon as she began talking about her outfit. Then Lauri also told her daughter that she didn't really like these shaggy 20-some-year-old guys that Michelle had been hanging out with recently. They seemed polite, but Lauri felt like they were just too old for Michelle, and they also didn't seem ambitious enough for an honor roll student like Lauri's daughter. One of them even lived in his mother's basement. Michelle had cursed at her mother when Lauri had said some things about her friends, and at that point, Lauri was furious and just couldn't contain herself. Lauri began complaining about all the time Michelle spent on her computer, specifically all the time that Michelle spent publicly embarrassing her family on the computer. Michelle was a blogger whose blog, called My Crappy Life, often harshly criticized the people in her life and referred to their town not as Craig, Alaska, but as Hell, Alaska. This online journal really upset Lauri because she wanted to give her daughter the best life possible, but the blog's title, My Crappy Life, really made Lauri feel like she had failed as a mother. But perhaps what bothered Lauri most about the blog was that Michelle had made their mother-daughter friction public. Once, Michelle had written about coming home from school and proudly telling her mother that she had scored a 92 on a Spanish test, but she had said her mom, Lauri, ignored her grade completely and just told her she should go to fat camp. But that wasn't even true. Lauri had told her daughter that maybe she should eat healthier, but never once mentioned fat camp. This fight they got into had ended with Michelle theatrically throwing even more black clothing into her suitcase and Lauri storming out of her room. Now, Thinking back over what happened, Lauri regretted the things she said and how blunt she had been. She still disliked the gloomy clothes, the two old friends, and the rude-seeming blog, but she really wished she had not offended her daughter. So while Michelle was off at her volleyball tournament, Lauri had written her a letter expressing how sorry she was that they had been arguing lately. Lauri said that she hoped they could get back to the way things used to be when they were closer. Lauri had left this note on Michelle's nightstand, knowing she would find it when she came home, and Lauri hoped it would help reset their relationship. Lauri walked down the hall into her and Doc's bedroom and changed into her nightgown. She brushed her teeth and got ready for bed. As she took off her wedding band and engagement ring, she thought about Doc, wishing her husband did not have to travel so much for work. Doc was a dozen years older than Lauri and not far from retirement age. Lauri had hoped that he'd start throttling down his workload, but lately it seemed that Doc had been busier than ever. But Lauri couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was another reason why Doc was staying away so much. She knew her husband had a wandering eye. People had made innuendos to her about that before. Lauri tried not to listen to the gossip. She knew Doc could be a flirt, but she was sure he would never actually cheat on her. Still, on this night, when Lauri was already feeling insecure about her relationship with her daughter, the rumors about her husband's supposed affair really nagged at her. Lauri slipped into bed around 11 p.m. She grabbed the television remote from the bedside table and turned on the television. She didn't mind a little solitude, but she had been on her own for a few days now, and she couldn't wait for her husband and daughter to come home the next day. After a few minutes of television channel surfing, Lauri turned out the lights and drifted off to sleep. At 3:30 p.m. the next day, which was a Sunday, Doc Waterman and his daughter Michelle drove towards their house. They had been in different cities over the weekend, but their paths had crossed at the airport, and so they headed home together. Like Lauri, Doc was a highly respected figure in town. The Vietnam War veteran had his struggles, including the lingering effects of post-traumatic stress, but he'd managed to build a family and a career as the top real estate agent on the whole Prince of Wales Island, which is one of the biggest islands in the entire United States. Doc steered his car down Ocean View and turned into his driveway. He then opened the garage door to park and immediately noticed that his wife's purple minivan was gone. Doc had expected Lauri to be home to greet them, but then again, she was always busy, even on a Sunday. Doc figured she must be out running an errand or attending a meeting, and at this point, Doc was actually far more concerned about his daughter, Michelle, who had sprained her ankle during her volleyball tournament. Doc helped his daughter limp into the house and upstairs. Michelle hobbled into her room and sat down on her bed. She looked over at her nightstand and saw the letter her mother had written her. She unfolded it, and as she started to read, she began to cry. She hated how much she and her mom had been fighting, and she too wished things were different. Eventually, Michelle wiped the tears away and put the letter down. Meanwhile, Doc walked into the kitchen to check the messages on the answering machine. He noticed an empty bottle of wine sitting on the counter, which he found very odd because Lauri really was not a drinker and certainly would not be drinking on her own. The answering machine showed 3 messages. Doc pressed play and listened, but all the calls were from him checking in as he made his way home. Doc carried his suitcase up to his and Lauri's bedroom on the 3rd floor. Normally, he'd drop his luggage on top of the comforter and start to unpack, but the bed was unmade. Lauri always made the bed, that is, if Doc didn't beat her to it. Doc also saw Lauri's nightgown thrown haphazardly on the floor. He frowned. His wife of 20 years was a total neat freak. What was going on? Doc suddenly felt flush with concern and stepped into the bathroom to splash water on his face. As he turned on the faucet, he saw Lauri's engagement ring and wedding ring sitting next to the sink. Now Doc was really worried. Lauri never went anywhere without those rings. Something very strange was going on. Doc couldn't tell what it was, but he had a sinking feeling that it was bad. Doc knew there were not that many places in their small town where Lauri might be, and he couldn't just call her because, in 2004, cell phones were still somewhat rare, and Lauri didn't have one. So Doc just waited a few hours, hoping Lauri would come home on her own. But by 7 p.m., when she hadn't, and he hadn't heard from her, Doc felt like he had to act. He didn't want to alarm his daughter, but he told Michelle that they needed to get in the car and drive around town and look for her mother. Doc and Michelle drove to the building where the Chamber of Commerce banquet had been held the night before, thinking maybe they'd see Lauri's purple minivan parked outside while she helped to clean up inside. But when they got there, her minivan, which anyone could spot a mile away, was nowhere to be found. Next, the father and daughter went to the church, but they didn't see Lauri's van there either. Doc did see Lauri's friend's car, and he remembered Lauri saying she had a committee meeting with her friend that day. But when Doc talked to Lauri's friend, the friend said that Lauri did not show up to the meeting and had not called to explain why she couldn't be there. So Doc and Michelle drove to the middle school where Lauri worked, but the parking lot was empty. Despite the near-freezing temperatures outside, Doc was sweating. When he and Michelle had started their search, he was perplexed. Now he was desperate. After driving around for almost 2 hours with no sign of Lauri, Doc and Michelle didn't know what else to do. So, at around 9 p.m., they went home, and the normally composed Doc tried to keep from choking up as he called the Craig police. At about the same time Doc was calling the police, Alaska State Trooper Bob Claus drove his SUV down a logging road that cut through a pine-covered mountain nearly 50 miles from Craig. He was one of only 2 troopers who patrolled the entire 145-mile Langi Island. Claus was out in this area, responding to a call he had received from a hunter who had said they had seen a vehicle that had gone off the road and caught on fire. Claus had spotted the plume of smoke in the sky and drove over, and there he found the remains of a minivan on the side of the mountain. It looked like the minivan had careened off the logging road until it struck a fallen log, which prevented it from rolling any further. The van was no longer on fire, but the brush and log beneath it were still smoldering. Claus climbed out of his vehicle and hiked down the slippery, wet slope to reach the wreck. When he got there, he saw the tires were melted down to their steel belts, the paint had been scorched off the frame, and all the windows were blown out. The fire had burned everything inside the vehicle. Claus looked for something to identify the minivan, but the license plate was a puddle of aluminum, and the vehicle identification number on the driver's side door was melted beyond recognition. Claus had originally come out here believing he was going to find a road accident, that someone had crashed, and that's why this had happened. But when he scanned around the inside of the vehicle, he felt like this was something far worse. If this had been an accidental car crash, Claus would have expected to see the driver's body in the front seat, or at least nearby, and some sign that they had been in the front seat. But the 2 front seats of the car were empty, and there was no sign of a driver. However, when Claus looked in the back of the car, he saw something absolutely horrible. There, laying across the back seat, were the charred remains of a human torso. Next to the torso, looking straight at Claus, was a blackened human skull. Claus didn't want to move the vehicle or disturb its contents until help arrived, so he radioed his partner and asked him to stay with the minivan while he called his lieutenant in Craig, Alaska. The lieutenant, in turn, called the Alaska Bureau of Investigation to send help. The Bureau promised to send a team, but cautioned that it would take time for help to arrive. Prince of Wales Island is located 800 miles south of Anchorage, and it has no major airports. The trip to the island requires 5 different planes. But finally, a day later, the small aircraft carrying state homicide investigator Randy McFerrin, a state fire investigator, and a crime scene technician touched down at a local airstrip. Right away, the investigators drove out to meet the state troopers on that logging road overlooking the crash site. When they got there, McFerrin peered down at the wreck, while the fire investigator immediately began taking pictures from the seat next to him. McFerrin, a former Army infantry officer, was an experienced investigator who had led 8 homicide investigations by himself. McFerrin got out of the vehicle and shook hands with Trooper Bob Claus. Claus was relieved to see heavy hitters from Anchorage on the scene. Claus had handled all kinds of cases over his career, but this case seemed far more complex than his twang station could handle. Claus told McFerrin that they had received a missing person report the night before from the husband of a woman from Craig, a community activist named Lauri Waterman. As he said Lauri's name, Claus grimaced because he knew Lauri really well. His daughter was friendly with her daughter, Michelle, and like most people in town, Claus liked both Lauri and Doc Waterman. It absolutely gutted Claus to think that Lauri could be the body in this wreckage, but he would tell the state investigators that that was looking more and more likely. The burned-out vehicle was clearly a minivan, just like the one Lauri drove, but the paint had all been scorched off, so it was impossible to tell whether it had once been purple. Claus, McFerrin, and the fire investigator walked down the slope to get a better look at the wreck. The wreck was about 50 yards down the mountain from the gravel road. When they got down to it, McFerrin peered inside at the charred human remains in the back seat. The clothes had burned off completely, and the fire had reduced the lower portion of their legs and the lower portion of the victim's arms to ash, making it truly impossible to tell whether the body was a man or a woman. But right away, the fire investigator could see telltale blistering in the back seat that suggested that an accelerant had caused the fire to burn very hot and fast. In other words, it looked like someone had set this fire on purpose. Adding credibility to that theory, the investigators couldn't find any skid marks on the road, suggesting the driver of this vehicle had never tried to stop. When people are about to crash, they hit the brakes and skid. But in this case, there was none of that. McFerrin sighed and looked over at Claus and said, "You know, whoever was in this car was murdered." He figured the fire was an attempt to destroy evidence, and whoever had set the fire had very nearly succeeded. Because the human remains that crime scene technicians removed from the van weighed just 33 pounds, the rest of the body was simply gone. McFerrin ordered the technicians to place all of the remains into an evidence bag and ship them to Anchorage for an autopsy. Meanwhile, Claus arranged for a tow truck to transport the wrecked minivan to a nearby garage for further analysis. As they moved the vehicle, McFerrin discovered a metal tag from the dashboard that had melted off during the fire. Miraculously, the vehicle identification number on the tag was still legible. Within minutes, investigators confirmed that the wrecked minivan belonged to Lauri Waterman. Later that night, McFerrin and Claus traveled to Craig to speak with Lauri's husband, Doc. Michelle was also home, along with her friend Jason Arant. Jason was a large man with flaming red hair, and at 24 years old, he was 8 years older than Michelle. The two had grown close when Michelle worked at a store owned by Jason's best friend the previous summer. Earlier that day, Michelle had called Jason, worried that something terrible had happened to her mother. She suspected a drunk driving accident due to the empty wine bottles she and her father had found in the kitchen. Jason had immediately left his job as a school custodian and gone to Michelle's school, finding her in the principal's office in tears. He then drove her home. McFerrin wanted to speak with the family alone, but Jason insisted on staying with Michelle until Trooper Claus stepped in. Jason had previously sought Claus's advice on becoming a Marine and respected the state trooper. When Claus firmly told him the family needed privacy, Jason listened and left. Doc invited the investigators into the television room on the first floor of the house. McFerrin and Claus sat on the couch while Doc and Michelle remained standing, bracing themselves for the news. After a brief pause, McFerrin leaned forward, carefully choosing his words. He told Doc that Lauri's burned-out van had been discovered in the woods 50 miles away, with a body in the back seat. While police still needed to make a positive identification, no one else had been reported missing, making it very likely that the body was Lauri's SES dot. For a moment, Doc was silent before stumbling back into a chair. He had seen his fair share of death in Vietnam and had never cried, but this was different. He buried his face in his hands and wept. Trooper Claus turned to Michelle, whom he had known since she was a little girl, and gently expressed his condolences. Michelle, however, didn't respond. Instead, she ran upstairs, slammed her bedroom door, and collapsed onto her bed. Her eyes fell on the letter her mother had written her. Unable to bear looking at it, she tucked it away in her nightstand drawer. Downstairs, McFerrin faced a difficult request. He needed Doc to obtain Lauri's dental records for identification. Doc silently flipped through Lauri's address book until he found the number for her dentist. McFerrin made the call, arranging for Lauri's latest x-rays to be sent to the coroner in Anchorage for confirmation. After the call, McFerrin and Claus asked Doc to walk them through the house and show them anything that seemed out of place. Since the previous day, Doc had found even more concerning evidence. He led them to the bedroom, pointing out a torn rubber glove tip and a 5-inch long fiber from a rope found in the bed sheets. Then, he pulled back the comforter to reveal a small blood stain on the sheets. Initially, he had assumed it was menstrual blood, but upon closer inspection, he noticed other spots on both sides of the bed. Doc admitted he had no idea who would want to harm his wife. Claus agreed, noting that Lauri was well loved in their community. McFerrin gently informed Doc that the house was now officially a crime scene and would soon be cordoned off with yellow tape. Doc and Michelle had to leave immediately. With the crime scene technician's assistance, McFerrin began a formal search of the house. Almost immediately, he discovered how the assailant had entered. Scratches on the lock of the door leading from the garage indicated a forced entry. Meanwhile, Claus searched Michelle's room. The walls were covered with posters of gothic-looking men and women dressed in black with dark makeup. As he combed through her dresser, shelves, and closet, he found Lauri's letter inside Michelle's nightstand. The letter was addressed, "To my dearest daughter." Claus felt a pang of sympathy for a mother who had desperately wanted to reconnect with her child. He made a mental note to return the letter to Michelle when the investigation concluded. When Claus and McFerrin regrouped in the television room, they reviewed their findings. Aside from the small bloodstains, there was no sign of a struggle. A few details suggested Lauri had been alive when she left the house. The nightgown, uncharacteristically thrown on the floor, implied she had changed clothes quickly. The rope fibers in the bed hinted that she may have been tied up rather than killed in the house. The break-in appeared clumsy, yet the presence of rope and gloves indicated prior planning. This suggested the crime was premeditated and not random. Typically, premeditated crimes involve someone with a personal grudge against the victim. However, the crude break-in attempt implied that the perpetrator was not familiar with the family. If they had known the Watermans well, they likely would have used the spare key instead of forcing the door. With no immediate suspects, the investigators turned to statistics. The most likely culprit in a murder case is usually the victim's spouse. That meant Doc was the first person they needed to scrutinize. Claus informed McFerrin of the small-town rumors about Doc having an affair, a significant red flag, as infidelity can be a motive for murder. Doc denied the affair but acknowledged that he was flirtatious and often away from home. Small-town gossip didn't require much to spread. However, even if he had been unfaithful, it wouldn't matter. Doc had a rock-solid alibi. At the time of the murder, he had been over 200 miles away in Juneau. McFerrin considered looking into the family's financial and phone records to see if Doc had hired someone to kill Lauri, but he doubted it. If Doc had orchestrated this, he likely would have told the killer where the spare key was, eliminating the need for a forced entry. On Tuesday, the 16th of November, McFerrin received a call from the coroner in Anchorage. As expected, the body in the van was confirmed to be Lauri's S.E. The coroner explained that the fire had reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, the same temperature used in cremation, destroying much of the remains and making a proper autopsy nearly impossible. The coroner had been able to match Lauri's dental x-rays with the teeth in the skull. However, the coroner was not able to determine the time of death or even how Lauri had died. McFerrin looked into Doc's bank accounts and found no indication of any money transfers, cash withdrawals, or suspicious gaps in income that could suggest he was trying to hide or transfer funds. The family's phone records were totally mundane, no unknown numbers or unusual late-night calls. McFerrin eliminated Doc as a primary suspect, and he was eager to talk further with Michelle, hoping she might shed some light on who might want to hurt her mother. A few hours after the coroner had identified Lauri's body, McFerrin picked up Michelle at her house and drove her to the police station for an official interview. On the short drive, McFerrin tried to make Michelle feel comfortable by telling her about his own daughter, who was just a few years older than her and in college. Michelle's eyes were red and puffy, but she seemed to relax and talked about a trip to Germany she and a friend had been planning for the following year. Eventually, they arrived at the small police station, where McFerrin escorted Michelle to a windowless interview room. Once they sat down inside, Michelle said she had spoken to her mother just before the Chamber of Commerce dinner on Saturday night. She said her mom seemed excited about the event and was looking forward to Michelle and her father coming home. Michelle also mentioned that her mom got along with everyone. In fact, Michelle admitted that she herself was likely the only person who regularly butted heads with Lauri. But even that was nothing major. Most of their arguments were over the way Michelle dressed or how she painted her nails black. McFerrin then picked up Lauri's letter, read it aloud to Michelle, and asked her what might have inspired her mother to write it. Michelle admitted that her mother did not like some of her friends because they were too old in her mother's eyes, and they had argued about that. She said her mom especially disliked Jason, the friend who had been at the house when investigators first visited. However, Michelle insisted that her mom just didn't understand. Lauri was convinced that Michelle was dating Jason, but Michelle said she was not. He was just a good friend, nothing more. McFerrin continued asking Michelle questions and eventually learned about her blog, which had also been a point of contention between her and Lauri. However, nothing major came out of the interview. Despite this, McFerrin was interested in looking more closely at Michelle's blog. After driving Michelle home, he and Claus returned to the station, loaded up Michelle's blog on a computer, and began reading. The blog was pretty harsh. Michelle frequently complained about her mother and even called her nasty names like Psycho. However, both McFerrin and Claus were fathers to teenage girls, and they were well aware of the friction that can exist between mothers and daughters. Nothing in Michelle's blog struck them as more than typical teenage angst, except for one thing: it was public. This led them to wonder if someone had become fixated on Michelle's conflicts with her mother. They decided to scour Michelle's electronic communications for any unusual or alarming messages. The next morning at breakfast, Claus spoke to his daughter, who was friends with Michelle. She said that students were in complete shock over Lauri's murder. Such things almost never happened in their tiny town, let alone to a friend's parent. Then, Claus's daughter mentioned something interesting. Michelle spent a lot of time with 3 people in particular: Jason, Jason's friend Brian Rell, and Michelle's ex-boyfriend, 16-year-old Ian Landrum. She said that Michelle and these 3 guys would often play video and fantasy role-playing games together. Sometimes, the 3 guys would just show up unannounced when she, Claus's daughter, was trying to hang out with Michelle alone. Claus's ears pricked up at this. Michelle had not mentioned that she had an ex-boyfriend. He immediately called McFerrin, and they decided they needed to speak with Ian Landrum right away. Later that morning, 3.5 days after the murder, McFerrin tracked down Ian at his house. The teenager had just woken up, but McFerrin noted that Ian was not surprised to see him. Ian said that everyone on the island had been talking about Lauri's murder. McFerrin followed Ian into his kitchen and sat at the small round table. Ian poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to McFerrin, and sat down across from him. Ian said that he had seen Michelle after she and her dad had searched for Lauri around town. He said he hadn't known anything about Lauri's disappearance, but he got worried about Michelle when she wasn't answering her phone. So that night, he had just gone over to her house to check on her. However, as soon as he said this, Ian immediately jumped up from the table and rushed to get sugar for their coffee. To McFerrin, it seemed like Ian was really nervous. McFerrin knew that people often got nervous when questioned by the police, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. He thanked Ian for the sugar, sipped his coffee, and kept his tone casual while watching for signs that Ian was hiding something. He asked Ian about his history with Michelle. Ian blushed slightly but admitted that they had dated for a while before breaking up a year earlier. However, they had remained close friends. McFerrin then asked about the two older guys, Jason and Brian, who also spent time with Michelle. Ian told McFerrin that he and Michelle were very good friends with them. Brian owned the shop where they often played video games, and Jason often joined in. Ian also admitted that Michelle's other teenage friends didn't really hang out when Jason and Brian were around. Jason in particular seemed to rub the girls the wrong way. McFerrin had met Jason briefly when he was with Michelle during the initial investigation. Now, he really wanted to talk to Jason again to find out why he made the girls uncomfortable. At noon that same day, McFerrin met with Jason at the trooper post near the high school where Jason worked. McFerrin brought Jason into an interview room and offered him some water. Jason nodded and took the bottle, but left it unopened. Jason, a big man nicknamed Red for his hair color, had once dreamed of becoming a Marine, but washed out of boot camp due to being seriously out of shape. After returning to Craig, he got a job as a high school janitor and moved into his mother's basement. He also started hanging out at his buddy Brian's computer shop. As McFerrin and Jason talked, Jason spoke slowly and very carefully. He admitted that he had previously dated Michelle, something Michelle never mentioned in her discussion with McFerrin that was pretty strange, he thought. But Jason said their romance didn't last long because it caused too much trouble for Michelle at home. McFerrin couldn't be sure if Jason was telling the truth about dating Michelle or if it was just male bluster. But Jason's claim suggested he knew Lauri disapproved of him hanging around her daughter. McFerrin started to wonder, did Jason want to get rid of Lauri because she was in the way? When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Jason said he'd been at his friend Brian's place playing video games. They'd both been drinking, so Jason just crashed there overnight. The interview ended, and McFerrin let Jason go home, but he still had too many unanswered questions about him. As it turned out, he wouldn't have to wait long to talk to Jason again. At 5:30 that afternoon, Trooper Claus was at his desk when his phone rang. On the other end, Jason's frantic voice barely made sense. Claus told him to take a breath, then asked what was going on. Jason shouted that he was at the school where he worked. He had just been attacked by a man with a knife. Claus hung up and immediately told McFerrin. The two investigators raced to the school. They found Jason sitting on the bleachers by the football field, in tears. He claimed a man had snuck up behind him near the dumpsters, held a knife to his throat, and warned him to stay away from Michelle, otherwise there would be another accident. Then, Jason said, the man ran the serrated blade across his neck before fleeing. Jason showed them a red mark on his skin. Claus and McFerrin exchanged a look. They'd already been suspicious of Jason, but now his story seemed bizarre. No witnesses, no real injuries, and that cut? It looked self-inflicted. Was this a desperate attempt to introduce a mystery suspect and throw them off track? McFerrin pressed Jason for a description of his attacker, but Jason fumbled. He claimed he didn't get a good look. McFerrin wasn't buying it. The attack supposedly happened in broad daylight. He had to have seen something. Jason's voice grew softer as he grasped for details. Fumbling, vulnerable. That's when McFerrin dropped the pretense. I think you're lying, he said flatly. Jason looked like he'd just been punched in the gut. Silent for a moment, then a deep sigh. Okay. No one attacked me, Jason admitted. I cut myself. Now McFerrin had him. He stepped closer, eyes narrowed. I think you're lying about something else, too, he said. About where you were the night Lauri Waterman was killed. Jason started stuttering. I'm not lying about that, he said, but his flushed face, sweaty palms, and circular rambling told a different story. McFerrin cut him off. I know you were involved in Lauri's murder. Jason's demeanor changed. He wasn't stuttering anymore. His voice had urgency, like he needed them to believe what he was about to say. You don't understand, he said. You don't know what Lauri did. She wasn't this perfect person everyone thought she was. Then Jason locked eyes with McFerrin. I didn't kill Lauri, he said, but I know who did. Based on Jason's statements and the evidence gathered, here's what happened to Lauri Waterman on the night of Saturday, the 13th of November, 2004. Not long after midnight, the killer stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. He picked up an electric razor, flipped it on, and methodically shaved off his bushy brown beard. When his face was smooth, he brought the razor to his head. Clumps of floppy brown hair fell into the sink. He knew from crime shows stray hairs could give a killer away. So, he made sure none of his would be left behind. A little before 1 a.m., the killer walked into his bedroom and grabbed a trash bag off the floor. He threw in a roll of duct tape, an old bristly rope, and a bottle of wine. With his break-in kit ready, he stepped outside, climbed into his partner's idling pickup truck, and the two drove to Lauri's house. When they arrived, the killer grabbed his trash bag, got out, and shut the passenger door. His partner sped away down the street. The killer stared at the big peach-colored house under the moonlight, reminding himself why he was there. A dangerous woman lived inside, and she needed to be stopped. He pulled a pair of latex gloves from the bag, slipped them on, and climbed into the two-car garage through a window. He tried the door leading inside, but found it locked. A butter knife scratched up the striker plate, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he removed the cat door, reached through, and unlocked it from the inside. Once in, he crept upstairs to the master bedroom. Lauri was fast asleep, but he didn't strike. Instead, he darted back downstairs and spent the next 2 hours pacing, psyching himself up. Finally, at around 3 a.m., he was ready. The killer grabbed his flashlight and other supplies and made his move. He burst into Lauri's room and immediately pulled a t-shirt over her head before she could wake up. Pinning her down with his weight, he smothered her, preventing any screams. Then, he secured a cloth over her mouth with duct tape and tied a rope around her neck like a leash. Dragging her from the bed, he rifled through her dresser, pulled out a sweater and jeans, and ordered her to change. Lauri complied, changing in front of him. He kept hold of the rope, but averted his gaze. Once dressed, he wrapped socks around her wrists before binding them with duct tape he didn't want any residue on her skin. The killer then forced Lauri downstairs into the kitchen. He sat her down, removed the gag, and opened the bottle of wine. He poured a full glass, held it to her lips, and forced her to drink. Again and again until she had finished the entire bottle. Then, he gagged her once more and led her to the garage. Opening the back door of a purple minivan, he ordered her to lie down across the seat. Lauri, now intoxicated, obeyed, but the killer wasn't taking chances. He tied her to an armrest, ensuring she couldn't run. Then, a problem. The tip of his latex glove had ripped. Worried that he had left a trace of DNA, he ran back upstairs to search for the missing piece. But it was gone. Cursing, he rushed back down. It was close to 4 a.m. Dawn was coming. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the van with Lauri's keys, and drove off with her bound in the back. His partner followed in the truck. They drove north for half an hour, leaving the paved roads behind. Then, another 30 minutes into the thick, wooded hills of Prince of Wales Island. Finally, the killer pulled over by a creek. His partner parked nearby. The killer spread a garbage bag on the ground and laid Lauri on top of Ide. Didn't want dirt on her clothes. The plan was to make it look like a drunk driving accident. Then, he crouched over her, wrapped his massive hands around her neck, and squeezed. A crack. But Lauri didn't die. Her gag slipped off, and her breathless, drunken voice tried to form words. Horrified, the killer panicked. He raised his flashlight and swung it into her neck again and again. But Lauri kept breathing. Desperate to end it, he pinched her nose shut and covered her mouth. Bound, gagged, and intoxicated, she had no chance. Lauri Waterman died in the middle of nowhere. The killer checked her wrist for a pulse. Nothing. But when he cut off the tape binding her wrists and ankles, he saw the marks. Worse, there was mud on her clothes. This wouldn't look like an accident. At 5 a.m., he placed Lauri's body back in the van, put it in neutral, and shoved it down a steep embankment. It crashed into a fallen tree. The plan had changed. His partner grabbed a jerry can of gasoline from the truck. The killer poured it over the minivan, the ground, and Lauri's body. Then, he backed away, lit a match, and tossed it onto the trail of fuel. Within seconds, the van exploded in flames. No one was there to see or hear it except the killer and his partner. They ran back to the truck and drove into town just before sunrise. The killer went home and played video games to calm down. His red-haired partner got ready for his shift at the high school. Then, just before heading to work, he got a phone call. Michelle. She wanted to know how everything had gone. Jason had told police he didn't kill Lauri. Technically, that was true. But he had driven the truck. He had helped plan the murder. And his friend Brian, the same Brian who was close with Michelle, was the one who actually carried it out. But they weren't acting alone. Michelle had slept with both Jason and Brian. They would have done anything for her. For months, over pizza and video games, she vented to them. She told them how Lauri hated the way she dressed, how her mother despised her interest in Wicca, how she feared Michelle would marry someone like Jason or Brian, wasting her potential. But most of all, she told them Lauri abused her, slapping her, beating her with a baseball bat, even threatening to sell her into prostitution. None of it was true, just dark fantasies, exaggerated mother-daughter conflict. But to Jason and Brian, Lauri wasn't just an overbearing mom, she was a monster, a threat to Michelle. And when Michelle told them she and her father would be away the weekend of the 13th of November, leaving Lauri home alone, they knew what they had to do. Investigators had already suspected Jason and Brian. But it was Jason's bizarre claim that he had been attacked by a stranger with a knife that sealed their fate. McFerrin and Claus knew he was lying about that attack, and they believed he was lying about Lauri's murder, too. Under pressure, Jason finally cracked. He admitted to helping plan it, admitted to driving Brian to the scene. And in exchange for a lesser sentence, Jason agreed to wear a wire. The recording caught Brian describing everything: the plan, the crime, and the roles they played. It was all they needed. Both young men, along with Michelle, were arrested. Brian was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 99 years. Jason pleaded guilty and got 50 years for his role. Michelle insisted she had told Jason to stop Brian. Maybe Jason never passed on the message. Maybe Brian ignored it. In 2011, Michelle was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of criminally negligent homicide. The jury decided that while she didn't take part in her mother's murder, She knew it was coming and did nothing to stop it. Michelle served 3 years in prison and was released in 2015. She moved to Florida, where she revived her My Crappy Life blog and continues to maintain it. A surfer named John Doyle was sitting on his surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, scanning the water and waiting for a wave. John was totally alone. There were no other surfers, no boats, nothing. The only sign of human civilization was his Land Rover parked on the sand back on the beach. John, an American from Colorado, was accustomed to snow-covered mountains and dense forests. But here, off the coast of Africa, the environment felt like an entirely different planet. The sun was relentless that day, pushing temperatures above 95 Fahrenheit. He could feel his back burning, and he decided that after catching one more wave, he would call it a day to avoid a painful sunburn. As he scanned the horizon, he suddenly spotted something terrifying about meters away. A shark fin sliced through the water, moving in a slow, ominous circle. It was the kind of stereotypical, nightmare-inducing shark behavior that every surfer dreads. John's heart pounded. He knew he had to get out of the water immediately, but he was too far from shore to risk swimming. Jumping in would mean thrashing around, possibly attracting the shark. His only option was to surf his way in. If he could catch a wave, he could ride it to safety without putting himself in the water. Keeping his eye on the shark, John desperately searched for an incoming swell. Minutes passed before he finally spotted the perfect wave rolling toward him. He quickly turned his board to face the shore, laid down, and paddled furiously. As the swell approached, he positioned himself, ready to pop up and ride it in. Just as he stood up, he glanced into the water below and saw the shark. It was right beneath him. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. He steadied himself and rode the wave, praying he could outrun the predator. For a few exhilarating moments, it seemed to work. He was moving toward shore, still above the water, still safe. Then disaster struck. In his panic, or maybe due to his unfamiliarity with the new surfboard, the nose dipped slightly. That tiny mistake was enough. John lost his balance and was thrown off his board, crashing into the water. He barely had time to react before he felt an excruciating pain in his calf. Underwater, through the swirling, cloudy water, he saw it clearly. A massive great white shark latched onto his leg. Panic exploded in his mind. He thrashed wildly, punching the shark's nose with all his strength. Incredibly, it worked. The shark recoiled, momentarily loosening its grip. Seizing the opportunity, John wrenched his leg free and clawed his way back. And it did. John yanked the board close to his body, using it as a shield. The shark lunged, its massive jaws clamping down, but instead of sinking into flesh, its teeth sunk into the surfboard. The great white ripped half of the board away and swam off, violently thrashing the broken piece in its jaws. John, now left with only half a surfboard and a bleeding leg, miraculously managed to stay afloat. With everything he had left, he rode the damaged board toward shore. Finally, he reached the sand. Crawling onto the beach, exhausted and in agony, he turned back and saw the shark disappearing into the depths. Relief washed over him. Had survived. But he wasn't safe yet. He was alone, an hour away from the nearest town, with nothing but wilderness between him and help. His leg was gushing blood, and he knew he had no time to waste. He dragged himself through the sand, inching toward his Land Rover. Once inside, he slammed the door shut, locked it, and immediately grabbed a white t-shirt from the passenger seat. He tore it into strips, fashioning crude tourniquets, and wrapped them tightly around his mongled calf. He cinched them down as hard as he could, but the wound was so deep that the bleeding barely slowed. John knew he was running out of time. Firing up the engine, he reversed off the beach and sped towards town. The pain was unbearable. The heat was suffocating. Dizziness crept in, and his vision blurred. He knew if he didn't drink something soon, he would pass out before he could reach help. Desperately, he fumbled around the car, searching for any liquid. But all he found was an empty water bottle, and all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna, with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. Luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copses of trees with a little creek that ran through it. Immediately, John pulled over, got out, and hobbled his way over to the water. He lay down on his stomach, so his face was basically right over the water, and then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. As he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit, and he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water. I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. With the little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and look to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bitten his side and was now growling and staring at John, beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Now, this was unbelievably painful for John, and he was already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack. John was experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience, and it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline, one that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting. With this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and began hitting this lion, who's locked onto his ribs, and he managed to beat the lion off of him. The lion only backed up maybe a few feet, and it was still totally fixated on John, growling and edging towards him. But John knew all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so, as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. He literally just walked past this lion, who was still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up, and he just kept on walking towards his car. He was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. When he turned around, he saw there was now not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There were at least 4 lions that had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John, moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. John just turned back around, so his back was to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continued hobbling towards his car. As he walked, the lions began swiping at him, cutting his legs open and his arms open. They were like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him. But they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. Then, right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. When he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process, and so John basically just resigned himself to be in his car right here. He knew, I'm going to die in the next few hours, there's nothing I can do. So he just kind of sat there and waited. 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion-like sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle, and then he heard it a few more times. Before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. Then, he heard what sounded like a series of shutter flashes like camera flashes. He was looking around, but he couldn't quite figure out what was even going on because, again, he had all these injuries. He had lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passed out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover, surrounded by lions. So, as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. Those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. Then, after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover because now the lions were gone. They took him to a hospital where doctors and nurses had to give him kaksisatavi sikumenta stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was. Point had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. When he turned around, he saw there was now not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There were at least 4 lions that had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John, moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. John just turned back around, so his back was to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continued hobbling towards his car. As he walked, the lions began swiping at him, cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they were like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him. But they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. Then, right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. When he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process, and so John basically just resigned himself to be in his car right here. He knew, I'm going to die in the next few hours, there's nothing I can do. So he just kind of sat there and waited. 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion-like sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle, and then he heard it a few more times. Before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. Then, he heard what sounded like a series of shutter flashes like camera flashes. He was looking around, but he couldn't quite figure out what was even going on because, again, he had all these injuries. He had lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passed out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover, surrounded by lions. So, as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. Those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. Then, after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover because now the lions were gone. They took him to a hospital where doctors and nurses had to give him kaksisatavi sikumenta stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was.